In this training module, you're going to learn to drive a diesel-electric locomotive and how the controls differ from a multiple unit. This is a BR Class 66 diesel-electric locomotive typically used for freight operations in the United Kingdom. In some trains, it is first necessary to insert the reverser handle. We need to do that on this one. We want to move the train forwards, so move the reverser in that direction. The train brake on the Class 66 uses a sprung lever. Holding it one way will gradually release the brakes until you release the lever. Holding it the other will gradually apply the brakes. You need to keep an eye on the two brake gauges in front of you. The larger one in the middle is the brake pipe. The outside needle shows the target pressure and the inside needle shows the actual pressure. When you apply or release the brakes, the outer needle moves and the onboard control systems will begin to adjust the brakes to match your setting. You can make a change to the brakes and focus on the road ahead while the system works to match the pressure you've set. The second gauge of note is the brake cylinder gauge, which is the second from the left. This tells you exactly what is happening with the brakes on the two sets of wheels on the locomotive. If the needles are raised to a V shape, that means they are fully applied. When the needles are both pointing directly down, the brakes on the locomotive will be fully released. You can learn more about braking systems elsewhere in the training center. But for now, you just need to remember that you are directly controlling the outer needle on the brake pipe gauge and that the end result is shown on the brake cylinder gauge. Keep the brake control in release until you can see the brake pipe control needle is reading 5 bar, pointing upwards. This will release the brakes fully. Watch the brake cylinder gauge to see it gradually reduce to 0.0. Needles pointing downwards, which tells you that the brakes are now fully released on the locomotive and you can move the train. It's important to note that the brake cylinder gauge is only telling you what's happening on your locomotive. If you have wagons attached, they can take a little longer to release, so if the train doesn't move immediately, don't worry. Apply some throttle to get the train moving. As you apply power, notice the ammeter rising, the gauge on the right-hand side with the colored sections. This is the amount of power being fed into the traction motors. Try to keep it in the green section, only briefly in the yellow, and avoid the red section to avoid damaging your traction motors. Now that you've reached your target speed, you can move the throttle control back to 0. The train will then coast on level ground and the train will only slow down very gradually. That's far enough. Bring this train to a complete stop by holding the brake control in the apply state until you see the brake pipe control needle in the center of your cab desk showing about 4 bar. The amount of braking you'll need to apply also varies depending on whether you're going uphill or downhill and how heavy. That concludes this module. If you wish to replay it, you can come back to it at any time via the training center. In this training module, you'll be learning about changing ends with a locomotive. Many types of locomotives have two cabs in order to make them as versatile as possible. While the cabs are often virtually identical, they are often referred to as either the A and B ends, number 1 or 2 end, or simply their front and back. Usually the designation of the cab is written somewhere in the cab. In the case of the Class 66, it's above the window on the right-hand side. In this case, you can see you're in the number 1 cab. All the junctions will be set for you in this module. You'll just be focusing on the locomotive. First, get the train moving forwards and drive over to the indicated stop marker and come to a stop in the platform somewhere. Okay, let's change ends. The basic process is always the same. Shut down the cab you're in and set up a new cab. Each cab has slightly different requirements to shut it down and set it up, however. Start by setting the reverser back to neutral. Now remove the reverser. Removing the reverser has automatically applied the brakes on the locomotive, so you don't need to worry about what happens when you change ends or what position to leave the train brake in. On this locomotive and on some others, you also need to make sure to put the locomotive brake in the release position when you're ready to switch cabs. If you don't, the controls in the other cab won't be able to release the brake. Before you move to the other cab, set the tail lights on and turn the headlights off. If you've used cab light or desk lights, Head to the other cab. You'll need to leave the train and get back on board at the other end. While some trains allow you to walk from cab to cab internally, it's often hot and uncomfortable. Notice that this end shows that you're in cab number 2 with the writing above the right-hand window. Get the cab set up as per normal and then pull forward to the marker in the other siding and come to a stop. That concludes this module. If you wish to replay it, you can come back to it at any time via the training center. In this trading module, you'll move some mineral wagons to a new location and learn how to couple and uncouple the wagons to your locomotive. All junctions are going to be changed automatically for you in this tutorial, so you can focus on driving. The mineral wagons are located ahead of us. Start by pulling gently forwards until you touch the wagons and stop. This will take some practice as it requires a lot more fine control. You'll find the locomotive brake is easier and more responsive. Take your time. If you hit the wagons too hard, they might come off the track, so try to be gentle and aim for 2 miles per hour or under as you touch them. You may also prefer the external camera to give more visibility, particularly as you get close to the wagons. The next step is to couple up. You can either do this by using the external camera or by getting out and doing it by hand. In this tutorial, you'll learn both techniques so you can decide which one you prefer. There are many types of couplers on the railways. In this case, you've got conventional UK chain couplings, which simply need you to put the loop over the hook on the other vehicle. In the sim, you can do this by simply interacting with the coupler when you see the appropriate prompt. Apply the emergency brake with the emergency brake plunger. This will empty all air out of the brake pipe and prevent the brake pipe from overcharging as you couple to the wagons. You'll do this one by getting out of the train. Leave the cab and walk over to the coupling. Interact with the coupling to couple the vehicles together. Now head back to the cab. Unset the emergency brake plunger to restore the brakes. Then you'll need to shut this cab down and change ends. Follow the instructions here or check out the training module that covers changing cabs in more detail. Set up the train while you wait for the yard manager to give you the all clear to reverse into the siding once they've changed the junctions required. Junction set, you're clear to go. Now pull the train forward and notice how the brake pipe responds more slowly as you release the brakes. You'll feel your train taking more time to respond. It will also feel sluggish as it has extra weight behind it. Take this into consideration as you drive, noting that it now takes longer to speed up and, more importantly, longer to slow down. Looks like you're good to go. Drive the train back into the siding now. Apply the emergency brake with the emergency brake plunger again. This time, use the external camera for the uncoupling operation. Switch to the external camera now. Fly the camera over to the coupling we want to uncouple. In this case, the one between your locomotive and the first wagon. Once you get close enough, interact with it as normal and it will uncouple. That concludes this module. If you wish to replay it, you can come back to it at any time via the training center. In this training module, you'll be learning about vehicles called control cars or cab cars. In the UK, they're often called driving van trailer or DVT cars, and you will likely come across other names for them too. The name cab car will be used for the rest of this module to keep it simple. Cab cars are essentially a passenger coach with a driving cab in them, but most importantly, they have no means of propulsion themselves. There are no engines or motors, so they can't move under their own power. The way that a cab car works is it will remotely control a locomotive at the other end of the train, and this is where it's important to understand their behavior as being a little different to the cab experience of the locomotive itself. There may be a little lag in control response, and you may not quite have the same instrument outputs as you do in the locomotive itself. For this module, you'll be taking this German Doppelstock cab car, which has a BR146.2 locomotive at the other end, setting it up and then driving it forwards to a marker at the other end of the yard area. Revisit this module a couple of times to try different things out and get familiar with the subtle difference when driving from the cab car. One of the biggest and most obvious differences when driving from the cab car is that there's a lot less sound. Since all the motors and fans are at the other end of the train, it can be a little disconcerting at first. Engage the brake system by turning this key. Put the reverser in forwards. Turn on the headlights and set the signal light switch to headlights. Most German trains have these two controls to enable headlights, one on the deck. Ensure the doors are closed. Release the brakes and apply some power to get moving. It feels a little odd at first. All the audio cues you're used to in the cab aren't present here, so you just need to give the locomotive time to react to your commands. Experiment with some power and some brakes and see how the train reacts. You may find some sharp jolts happening because of how the slack is being bunched up or stretched out by the loco at the back. You can minimize this by making your first power or brake applications lighter and then increasing them. You'll get used to this with practice and experience. Cut the This is far enough. Bring the train to a stop now by applying the train brake. This is just a brief introduction to cab cars. The changing ends for cab cars training module goes into more depth about both the cab car and the BR146.2 locomotive on the other end of the train. That concludes this module. If you wish to replay it, you can come back to it at any time via the training center. In this training module, you'll practice going between the BR146.2 locomotive at one end of the train and the cab car at the other. All the junctions are being taken care of for you by another team member, allowing you to focus on driving. You're starting here in a siding near the main loop. Get started by climbing in. Insert the reverser handle and set the reverser to forward. Set the headlights to bright, and on the back wheel set the signal lights to headlights. Release the brakes and apply power to get moving towards the marker. Stop anywhere here by applying the brakes. It's time to get the locomotive cab shut down. Move the train brake handle to the full service position. Set the reverser to off and remove the reverser handle. That will deactivate the cab. On the back wheel, change the signal lights to tail lights so that the locomotive shows red lights now that it's at the rear of the train. With the cab shut down, you can move to the other end of the train. Exit the cab and walk along the side of the train to the cab car. Don't forget to close the door before you leave. Open a passenger door on the cab car to get in and make your way to the cab and sit in the driver's seat. You now need to get this cab set up. Start by turning the brake key to activate the brakes. Insert the reverser handle and set the reverser to forward. Set the headlights to high beams, and on the back wall set the signal lights to headlights. Check if there are any doors open, and if so, close them. You're good to go. Release the brakes, apply the power, and take the train out. You're headed out onto the main line and will be stopping at the main station on the loop. That concludes this module. If you wish to replay it, you can come back to it at any time via the training center. In this training module, you're going to learn how the German AFB cruise control system works. Many German trains use this type of cruise control, and much of the fundamentals you learn here will apply to other trains that have some equivalent form of cruise control. It's important to note that there are fundamentally two types of cruise control. One is an active system like AFB, which will manage your speed positively using throttle and brake as needed. The other is a speed set system, which is useful for setting a maximum speed. Speed set could usually maintain your speed, but can't reduce it as easily as a system like AFB. For this exercise, you'll be doing 2 laps of the main loop here at the training center. The first time around, you'll be learning how to set up AFB and use it from standstill. The second time, you'll learn how to enable AFB while your train is already running. Set up the train, but don't start moving yet.
Störung. Störung.
Turn the AFB system on.
AFB. AFB.
You can now set the
AFB.
target cruise speed using the AFB lever. Set it to 40 km per hour for now. Release the brakes and apply power. As the train accelerates, you can apply more power as needed. The train has reached its cruise target and has cut power. It will now manage the speed as needed automatically. You can leave the power handle with the power applied, and this grants the amount of power available for AFB to use. Increase the AFB lever to 80 km per hour and watch the train accelerate to the new target. Increase the AFB lever back to 40 kilometers per hour and see the train will manage itself back to 40 kilometers per hour. Coming back to the platform, so set the throttle to off and get on the brakes as needed to come to a stop somewhere in the station. Getting AFB running while stationary is quite straightforward, but sometimes you may want to activate it while you're on the move without having to stop. Set the AFB lever to off and turn the AFB switch to off so that we can try that exercise next.
AFB, AFB, AFB.
Now you're doing about 40 kilometers per hour, it's time to get the AFB system enabled. First, completely cut the power handle to off. Next, set the AFB to the maximum position. Don't worry, it can't do anything because the power handle is set to off. Now activate the AFB switch to turn AFB on.
AFB, AFB,
Move the AFB
AFB.
lever to 80 kilometers per hour so it can speed up. Finally, apply some power. Notice that we're now accelerating, and if all has gone well, you'll see the power cut out around the 80 kilometers per hour mark as AFB is managing your speed. Notice how even though the cruise control is set to 80 kilometers per hour still and power is applied, it's still not accelerating. This is because the brake application caused a throttle lockout. To reset it, you need to put the power back to off and then reapply it. Perfect. You're accelerating back up to 80 kilometers per hour. You're headed back to the station again, so bring the throttle to off and use your brakes to bring the train to a stop in the platform. It is important to remember that a cruise control system like this is no substitute for the driver paying attention and remaining responsible for the train. Cruise control systems also cannot be relied upon to slow the train at an appropriate rate when approaching red signals or speed reductions, so you should be ready to use your brakes as needed. That concludes this module. If you wish to replay, you can come back to it at any time via the training center.